It's crazy to think that this, or this, or even this can be traced back to a British company discovering oil in Iran. Ever since that moment over 100 years ago, Iran has been gripped in the chokehold of Western superpowers, from billion-dollar business deals to secret intelligence operations by the CIA and the MI6. Even though Iran was never technically colonized, it was used as a pawn in a game of geopolitical chess played by the US and the UK, who saw an opportunity to exploit the country's natural resources and overthrew its government when it tried to defy them. And the crazy part is that the oil company still exists today, just with a different name: British Petroleum, or BP. The rise of one of the most ruthless dictators in the 21st century, Ayatollah Khomeini, and his radical Shia Islamist regime was the direct result of American and British meddling in Iranian politics, and millions of Irani citizens suffered for it. Women who were once free were now forced to stay indoors and wear hijabs, and anyone who spoke out against the government was arrested and convicted in sham trials. And as all this happened, Western powers looked on in silence, fully aware of their involvement in this disaster. But who would hold them accountable? This is how Iran, one of the oldest civilizations in the world, one of the most promising nations emerging from the Middle East, became a puppet of the West, and then went completely rogue as one of the most volatile Islamic nations in the world. It begins with quite possibly the worst business deal in history. In 1901, the Shah of Iran granted a 60-year oil concession to a British businessman, William Darcy. This deal was massive. It gave Darcy total access to almost all of Iran's land to look for oil and gas, and once he did, had to pay a measly 16% of annual profits to the Irani government. It almost didn't work out. Darcy spent the next 7 years searching for oil in Iran, sinking £500,000 British pounds, and still came up empty-handed. He wrote a letter to his geologist telling him to pack up and go home. But that man refused to give up and kept searching. And in May 1908, they did it. They'd managed to find oil in Iran. Darcy's huge risk paid off big time. And so, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born. The timing could not have been more perfect. Just a couple of years after the APOC had begun extracting oil, World War I broke out. The British Royal Navy under Winston Churchill were in the process of transitioning their ships from coal-powered engines to oil, which made them much more efficient and powerful. That's when the government realized how important oil was going to be in the coming years, so they decided to buy a majority stake in APOC to the tune of £2 million, effectively nationalizing the company. But while Darcy and his company made millions in profits from selling oil, the people of Iran were sinking deeper into poverty. APOC used shady accounting practices like offering secret discounts to the Navy and paying a profit tax to the British government, making it look like their profits were much less than they actually were, thereby minimizing the Iranian government's 16% royalties. At the end of World War I, the Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, said that Britain had floated to victory on a sea of Persian oil. Meanwhile, local workers at the Iranian oil refineries were being paid 50 cents a day to work in grueling conditions, living in slum-like homes without running water, electricity, or sanitation. It even got to the point where the British were basically treating Iran like one of their colonies, invading and occupying the country during World War II for strategic reasons. They forced their army to surrender and made the Shah of Iran abdicate his throne and appointed his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as the new ruler. But not everyone in Iran was willing to sit quietly and let the British bulldoze their country. People were getting tired of the constant intervention by the British government, especially their exploitative petroleum industry that only benefited them and the royal family, not the rest of Iran. Things took a turn in 1949 when a gunman tried to assassinate the Shah. This incident freaked him out and he started taking a more active role in politics. Well, that's one way to put it. What he was really doing was consolidating power under himself by amending the constitution and forming a senate with his close allies in the government. But people noticed what he was trying to do and began to call him out on it. The loudest voice of the opposition was a charismatic man named Mohammad Mossadegh. he publicly voiced his concerns about the undemocratic power grab by the Shah and garnered support for his secular pro-democratic coalition called the National Front. And he had more than one reason to hate the Shah. In 1940, he'd been jailed and almost executed by the Iranian government for protesting against their authoritarian rule. He wanted the Shah to retreat to a ceremonial role, like most royals had in the 20th century, and give up his power to an elected government. More than that, he wanted to kick the British out of Iran and reclaim the country's natural resources. This was the perfect time for Mossadegh to strike. The nation was weakened by decades of exploitation and corrupt rule. The people were struggling with economic stagnation, and the Shah's rule was looking worse day by day. Supported by a wave of nationalist fervor, Mossadegh was elected Prime Minister by the Parliament of Iran in 1951. He was a rising star in the country, extremely popular with the citizens and equally hated by the Shah. Mossadegh didn't waste any time. He began rolling out reforms to give factory workers employment benefits, support for unemployed people, and increase taxes on landlords to fund public projects. But by far his biggest move was nationalizing the APOC, seizing their infrastructure and assets, and creating the National Iranian Oil Company. This was an insanely bold move. Not only was he defying the terms of the deal signed by the old Shah of Iran, but he was essentially giving the middle finger to the British. Let me remind you that this was back in the 1950s, when the UK was still a major military and political superpower. Taking a decision like this required serious balls. Of course, now he'd made an enemy of the British, who accused him of breaching a legally binding contract, stealing from the British, and insulting the British Empire. They sent warships to blockade the Iranian port of Abadan and imposed economic sanctions on Iran. They blocked British exports to Iran like sugar and steel, froze Iranian assets in British banks, and withdrew all their technicians from their oil fields. When Iran tried to hire non-British technicians to run their machinery, they were flatly refused by Europe, the US, and even Pakistan. Even when Italy agreed to help Iran export their oil, Britain sent their navy to block Italian oil tankers. The message was crystal clear: cooperate with the British or be boycotted by the Western powers and starved for resources. But even these embargoes weren't enough to break the resolve of Iran, who were holding strong despite the pressure. Britain was getting impatient. Not only were they stuck paying more for oil from the Saudis, but they were in the middle of another war in Korea. If this democratic government actually succeeded in Iran, it would be the end of cheap oil for the UK. So they approached that one other country that was even better than them at subjugating foreign nations, the United States. Now, obviously, if Britain went to them saying how unfair it was that Iran breached the contract and that their economy was in trouble, the US wouldn't care. What was in it for them? But the British knew that there was one word that would instantly get the attention of any American president, especially in the 1950s: communism. They explained how Iran was coming under the influence of the Soviets and that them nationalizing the oil company was the first step towards turning the whole country into a Marxist dystopia that would sell all their oil to Russia. Alarm bells went off in the White House, and President Dwight Eisenhower mobilized his best operatives in the CIA to help the British tackle Iran's democratic government. I can't help but be amazed at the irony of the situation. Western nations, especially the US and the UK, act like these big watchdogs of democracy in the world. But the moment a country in Asia or the Middle East tries to implement democracy but refuses to comply with Western demands, suddenly they're the problem and need to be fixed. I mean, why wouldn't the rest of the world want US intervention in their politics? It's worked out so well for us in the last century. The CIA and MI6, Britain's intelligence agency, decided the quickest way to displace the troublesome Mossadegh was to overthrow the entire government itself. By 1953, the embargo against Iran had left the nation starved of resources, and Mossadegh's popularity was waning as Iran was steeped in economic turmoil. It was the perfect opportunity for the British and Americans. They launched Operation Ajax, a secret mission to engineer an artificial resistance against the Iranian government. It would be masterminded and financed by British and American intelligence and supported by the Shah of Iran himself. CIA agents arrived in Iran carrying suitcases full of cash. They used this to bribe newspaper editors to publish fake news and inflammatory stories discrediting Mossadegh, further eroding public trust in his administration. They hired people to stage riots in the streets and even created a fake communist party to give the US an excuse to intervene. In August 1953, the CIA incited city-wide protests in Tehran, which made it look like there was much greater opposition to Mossadegh than there really was. The riot snowballed out of control, gathering thousands of protesters who supported the Shah. The general of the Iranian army seized the opportunity to storm government buildings and arrested Mossadegh. In a matter of days, the brief flash of democracy in Iran was winked out. The US helped reinstall Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, as an absolute monarch, giving him a level of control he'd never enjoyed even before the Mossadegh era. And initially, the people welcomed his return. The country had been so totally drained by Britain's economic sanctions that this new regime gave them some much-needed relief. But it wouldn't take long for those warm feelings to turn sour. Over the next decade and a half, the Shah would systematically suppress and punish any opposition to his rule, and critics of the government would be arrested and sometimes even executed. With the help of the CIA and France's intelligence agency, the Shah formed a secret police force called the Savak, who conducted mass surveillance of citizens, routinely arresting and torturing dissenters. At the same time, he launched the White Revolution, an ambitious campaign of reforming Iran with Western values, like allowing women to vote, improving literacy rates, secular education, and sweeping land reforms. Now, all of these sound pretty great, right? But not everyone thought so. The Shia Muslim community in Iran was incensed by the Shah's new reforms because secular education threatened to undermine the Islamic education framework. Many Orthodox Muslim leaders believed women shouldn't be given the power to determine the nation's leaders, and the land reforms weakened the clergy's control over rural Iran. Besides, the Shah had made several concessions for the US and other Western nations since he took the throne. He reversed Mossadegh's nationalization of Iran's oil industry, granted diplomatic immunity to US military in Iran, and even received US backing to stabilize his regime. As discontent against the Shah's rule deepened in Iran, one man emerged as the loudest voice of the opposition. He was a leader of Shia Islam, a man staunchly opposed to the new reforms in his country and skeptical of American influences on Iranian politics. Throughout the 1960s, he could be found at the head of public protests, calling for a boycott of the White Revolution and demanding an end to Iran's dependence on the United States. In 1964, he was arrested and exiled from Iran, and he wouldn't return to his homeland for another 15 years, at which point he would fundamentally change the course of Iran's history forever. That man was Ruhollah Khomeini, and he was the symbol of a growing movement that was spreading in the country. By the 1970s, that movement would reach its breaking point. As the Middle East saw its biggest oil boom in the 1970s, inflation skyrocketed in Iran and income inequality started to spiral out of control. While the rest of Iran struggled with rising cost of living, the royal family and their close allies were getting rich off the spoils. The government half-heartedly tried to introduce austerity measures, but they only ended up hurting the working class population even more. By 1978, protests grew more frequent and vigorous, and it seemed like every action the Shah took just made things worse. It didn't help that his response was to send his Savak police after the protesters, tear gassing, arresting, and even shooting down those who fought back. The end had already come for Reza Pahlavi. He just didn't know it yet. The Shah fled the nation in January 1979, and just 2 weeks later, Ruhollah Khomeini made his triumphant return. The people were overjoyed. The man who had stood up to the Shah's tyranny had finally come back. The streets were swarming with cheering citizens. The idea was to install Khomeini as the new Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Shia Islam worldwide, to provide spiritual strength and guidance to the new government. Even the US was on board. President Jimmy Carter was planning the transition from the Shah to another pro-Western administration. Except, that's not what happened. Khomeini announced that he would form a provisional government appointed by himself, and to oppose it was blasphemy. He called for his followers to take over the streets of Iran and drive out the old government, which they did in overwhelming numbers. At one point, civilian rebels attacked a weapons factory and seized thousands of guns, which they used to capture police stations and military bases. Things quickly spiraled out of control from there, and by February 1979, the old government of Iran had collapsed completely, giving way to the rule of the Ayatollah. Now, this was something the US was not expecting. Instead of acting as a spiritual guide to the Shia Muslims of Iran, sort of like the Pope in the Vatican, Ayatollah Khomeini quickly consolidated power under himself, crushing any rival political factions and establishing his own Islamic government. This was a huge problem for the US, who were public enemy number one as far as the Ayatollah was concerned. US-Iran relations took a nosedive in November 1979 when Iranian protesters stormed the US embassy in Tehran, holding 66 US diplomats and civilians hostage, some of them for over a year. From this point on, the entire Middle East would become a seething vortex of armed conflicts, proxy wars, and threats of nuclear destruction. Iran was now ruled by an absolutist Shia Muslim regime, which posed a threat to the surrounding Sunni Muslim countries like Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Iraq invaded Iran. Both Iran and the Saudis launched proxy wars against each other by funding militias to fight wars in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. And all the while, the United States repeatedly staged interventions whenever they didn't like the direction things were going. The irony is that their strategic interference flared up or more often created entirely new problems for both their allies and their enemies. They were the ones who essentially created the modern Islamic terrorist by funding Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The CIA's actions indirectly led to the rise of Saddam Hussein, who ultimately had to be targeted and brought down by US forces. They've consistently provided financial and military support to the Saudis, Israel, Pakistan, and plenty more. Not to mention their own military operations that have, in many cases, targeted civilian populations and probably violated every single Geneva Convention. Iran's Islamic dictatorship has maintained a vehemently anti-US stance from the moment they took control of the nation, condemning any values they viewed as Western. Ruhollah Khomeini's successor, Ali Khamenei, no relation by the way, reinforced the Shia Islamic tenets of the state, doubling down on the repression of Iran's women and non-Muslim population. His government was equally hostile to neighboring US-friendly Sunni nations. But in the last 2 decades, the people of Iran got sick of the restrictions imposed by the Ayatollah's regime. Women couldn't wear what they wanted. They couldn't go out freely in the public. The country's anti-US stance meant that they were frequently subjected to international sanctions, and with the US repeatedly invading neighbors like Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, the region became permanently unstable. It didn't help that Iran was trying to develop its own nuclear program, which made Western powers deeply worried about the threat of nuclear war. In December 2025, what started as a protest by merchants and shopkeepers against the rising dollar exchange rate quickly spiraled into a nationwide movement against the government. The economic crisis, along with decades of social repression, had created a powder keg ready to blow. It's at this point that, yet again, the United States, now under Donald Trump, decided to intervene. Here's how David Sanger, White House correspondent for the New York Times, summarized the situation. With his broad attack on Iran early Saturday morning and his call to the Iranian people to overthrow their government, President Trump has embarked on the ultimate war of choice. He was not driven by an immediate threat. There was no race for a bomb. There were no indications of a coming Iranian attack on the United States, its allies, or its bases in the region. Instead, Mr. Trump struck the Islamic Republic largely because he apparently sensed a remarkable moment of weakness for the government and the opportunity for the United States to topple Ayatollah Ali Khamenei after 47 years of episodic confrontations. The situation couldn't be more clear. For the third time in 70 years, the US has chosen to interfere in the politics of Iran, and the result has been bloodshed, this time on an international scale. The question now is, what's America's plan? Are they gonna keep bombing Iran and assassinating their leaders until someone more friendly to US interests takes over the government? Are we gonna see yet another regime change engineered by Western hands? I mean, just look at how White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt responds to questions from a reporter.
Is the ending of this war also contingent on Iran selecting a leader that the president finds acceptable? And if so, how is that not the definition of a regime change war?
Look, as President Trump has blatantly and frankly stated, it's obviously within the best interest of the United States and the West to no longer have a radical terrorist in charge of Iran. As for the timeline of the military operations with respect to Iran, we have objectives that we have laid out that the Commander-in-Chief wants to see achieved. When they are achieved, then it will ultimately be up to the President to end this operation.
The longer these Western powers continue to act as an oppressive world police, the more we're going to see extremist and radical responses to what is essentially 21st century colonialism. And it's exactly that kind of reckless meddling that's created an epidemic of terrorism out of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I've made a whole video about the rise of terrorist groups like the Taliban, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Al-Qaeda, who were created by militants trained and funded by the US in Afghanistan and Pakistan with the help of the Pakistani army. Ever since, India has been on the receiving end of multiple wars and deadly terrorist attacks, all because the US was afraid the Soviets would spread communism to Afghanistan. You can watch my full video on the birth of terrorism in Pakistan right here. Please support my channel by liking this video, get subscribed, and become a channel member to get early access to videos and exclusive content. It really helps me keep making videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.